Hello and welcome to CG Visuals. My name's Zach, and in this exciting tutorial we'll learn how to use Trapcode Elements to create this effect. If you'd like to see more tutorials like these, then subscribe to our VFX YouTube channel to learn more. Trapcode Elements is a collection of presets that allow you to create water, earth, fire, and airbending simulations directly within After Effects. In order to follow along with this tutorial, you'll need to download either the Trapcode Elemental Fire Pack or the full Trapcode Elements collection. Red Giant's Trapcode Particular version 4.1 is also required and can be downloaded from their support page by going to the Installers window, visiting the Updates section, selecting Trapcode Particular and downloading version 4.1.5. So once we've opened After Effects, we can drag our footage that we're going to use for this example into our timeline. And before we preview the footage, it's worth going into the settings and making sure we have the correct preview frame rate. So if we play back our footage, we can decide how the tracking is going to look. So there's a decent camera movement, so it should be fairly easy for our 3D camera tracker within After Effects to solve that track. We can play this back and we can also preview the track points as well. So it looks like a solid track. It's ignored our actor for the most part, which is good. And the next step is to select these points and choose Create Solid and Camera, and this will place a 3D camera in our scene and a reference layer for us to look at as well. And if we see the position there, we can see it's a fairly sensible value in 3D space. For example, if we create a new layer and turn that into a 3D layer and then click on the position, we'll give it a grid effect as well. We can see it is created in the center of the frame at a fairly sensible position. So if it was, say, too small or too far away, or there were astronomical values, we'd need to look at a process called normalizing our 3D track. But since that's not the case, we'll save this in a folder, keeping a good naming convention and file structure, as this can get quite complicated once we have multiple shots. And the next thing we'll do is import one of the projects from Trapcode Elements. So I'm going to go to the Fire category, into the Fire Blast subfolder, and select this Rapid Fireball Manipulation project. So that's going to load in, and we can open that file structure there, and we'll go straight to the Particles comp. Now there is an export comp, but we're going to go straight to setting up the simulation. And we can see it's a 16-bit comp here, but we can also change that to 32 bits, which is a little bit slower but gives you some brighter highlights. But while we're in the Particles comp here, we'll disable the motion blur to start with. And then we'll select our 3D camera from the tracking comp, and we'll simply Control-C, Control-V, copy and paste that into the Particles comp. And so now, and we'll also, for reference as well, I think we'll bring in our plate that we have as well. And we'll trim the timeline down. And so now we have our 3D camera, our footage, and the simulation all in the same space. So to make things a little bit easier, if we select our footage, and we'll just get an idea of how this thing is looking. So the first thing we'll want to do before we start animating is to create a solid layer that we can use to help us visualize the animation. So a red solid layer, use an elliptical mask. I use this on almost every project that involves a lot of animation. To help us isolate some layers here, I'm just going to solo the footage. I'll name our red solid, open up the position for both the emitter reference and the emission locator, and just pick whip that red circle to the emission locator. And so now we can just focus all of our attention on the animation itself. If we press U on the particle controls, we'll see some preset keyframes for the emission rate and an increase in fluid buoyancy over time. So I guess we'll offset those particles a little bit, as that will determine when the fire actually starts. Delete all of the keyframes from our emission locator because we're going to create our own custom animation. And the first thing we'll need to do is bring this layer back in Z space a bit. And now we're going to use, with loose spacing, we'll go through this animation, and without being too precious over it, we're just going to get it into roughly the right location. So going forward a handful of frames, making an estimation of whether it needs to come forward or backwards. So I think he's moving his hands backwards a little bit here, so it will help to get a bit of depth in our animation as well. So he brings his hands right back, so probably going to go back in Z space a bit more there. And let's see how long we want this to last for. So he's bringing his hands back in, and that's when the simulation will end, and there'll be a different simulation when he punches his hands forward. Although even if the fluid simulation stops emitting, it may still be affected by the animation of the emitter. So some of that motion will carry into the fluid sim even after the particles have stopped being emitted. So then we're going to select continuous Bezier for the interpolation motion here, and that will smooth out some of the handles. Won't do a perfect job, but if we go to the orthographic views, also get an idea of how this looks from a side view as well. Because we've estimated our animation, we don't need to be too precious here, but if we see anything that looks off, we can just make some tweaks there. Always better to work loosely though in the beginning. And now if we preview this back, now we can do a second pass and try to identify where things are going wrong. That's a good point to note that because our particles comp is 50 frames per second, to get the accurate playback speed, we'll select that frame rate to 50 as well. And then going back through our animation, we'll adjust some of these handles. Try and use as few keyframes as possible. And so at this stage you can take the time to try and get this motion looking very fluid. As it matches up with the motions that the actor is portraying. We want our emitter to try and interpolate what our actor is doing, as if it's an invisible force. And once we're happy with that animation, if we unhide our layers there, we'll disable our red ball, and I think we'll be brave and enable our first simulation. But before we start previewing things, I think we can turn the motion blur off, and this refine soft matte edges is quite an expensive effect, adds a lot of additional effects to the edges of the fire. So we'll disable that. To make things a little bit easier to see, we'll also just put a curves adjustment on our plate as well. Especially if we have quite a bright daylit scene. We can really just look at what the particles are doing. So this way of working is a lot faster than just going straight to the export comp and trying to do renders there. So as we go through, it looks like we're getting a fairly decent result straight off the bat, which is nice. Our particles are being occluded on the floor there. It's kind of our grid layer also controls the floor. That would be handy if we needed that, but it's coming from off frame, so we'll just bring that grid down. Notice how we're jumping forward in little increments. That's because the fluid simulation is being cached into your RAM as you work, so the further you jump ahead on the timeline, the more has to be RAM previewed before it can be displayed. And there's always the possibility that the fluid simulation could break as well, and that could cause a delay in the preview. So now that we've got our animation going, we can enable the other layers as well. And we'll increase our motion blur samples. Sometimes I like to go for 32 samples with the embers. We'll re-enable this soft matte edges effect. And we'll put this to full res so that we can demonstrate the difference between the preview quality and the full quality. So this obviously will take a bit longer to preview, but that's okay because we only need it for our final render. And if we take a snapshot, we can toggle back and forth between the half-res version. Has the motion blur in there, there's enough detail in the fire. So that will look very nice once it's rendered and we bring that into the export comp. So I'm going to render this as an asset, QuickTime, RGB and alpha using the animation codec. And we'll click OK to that, and as this is an asset, I'm going to render it to an assets folder. We may have multiple versions of the asset, so it's nice to keep it in a structure that makes sense. And then we'll go ahead and render this. And obviously there are two fire paths, so as you've seen me do one of the fireballs there, I've also repeated the process, moved the emission locator to the other hand, and just made the same adjustments to the motion as well. Once that emitter was animated on the other hand, I simply rendered that asset as well. So I'll be bringing in two assets here, the left fire blast and the right one. But it was exactly the same process. So now we can bring those assets into the particles comp, and they are now pre-renders. So we can have that in our final comp, and we won't have to render the simulation when we're doing the compositing. So that will make the compositing a much smoother experience. So we'll go into import, we'll go to Trapcode Elements again, into the Flamethrowers category. And I'm going to bring in this gasoline flamethrower, which is quite a long, fairly large flamethrower, which I think will be appropriate for this specific effect. We want the flames to feel quite powerful, and we're going to use some interesting techniques to get that effect. So here we have our file structure for the project here. It also has a particles comp. To avoid any confusion, the expressions will reference to particles comp. I'm just going to name that to particles comp B so that we don't have any confusion either on our end or with After Effects. And then we'll wait for this to load, and we can see our gasoline flamethrower. So we're going to do the same steps as last time, which is to take our tracked camera from the tracking comp, paste it into our particles comp B above the scene camera that's in there. Sometimes I extend the camera by a few frames just to avoid any strange anomalies happening on the last frame, though it usually doesn't matter. Same as before, I'm bringing in our plate as well. Darken it down with a curves adjustment. We'll enable our simulation, so we have them all in the same space. We also have this proxy simulation. Now, when we disable the motion blur, we've kind of made our own proxy version, but the proxy simulation has all of the motion blur disabled and usually has less particles as well, so it can be faster. And in this case, I think it will be worth just using that. So to rotate this flamethrower, we've gone into the particles comp and we're using the aim left and right controls. And then we'll also move the emission locator towards the center as well. So we want these flamethrowers going into the camera. So I'm going to get to the point where he's holding out the fists, where it's insinuated that the fire is going to shoot into the camera. And to get the actual position of where our actor is, I'm just going to create a null object on that one tracking point there. So that's his shoulders. That has the position data for where his shoulders would be relative to the camera. And if I paste that null object, I can simply bring it forward a bit from his shoulders to where his fists would be, estimating that, and it looks like that null is stuck to the end of the hand there, so that's fairly close. And I can just copy the position data from that track null into the emission locator, and now that's in approximately the right space. He's also shaking his fists around a bit, so if we add a bit of animation in there, it's just going to really make the fire feel like it's glued to his hands. So that's 2 layers of animation, the camera animation and also animating it to be attached to the actor's hand as well. It doesn't need to be super accurate, because with fluids it's going to be quite chaotic anyway. So I'm just going to run through here, put in these keyframes. Sometimes difficult to understand the animation just looking at the null object, so I'll do the same thing as last time, create a red solid, make it into a circle and just pick whip the position. And now if we preview it back, we can decide whether we're happy with that animation or not. So it's quite a handy thing to do. So we also have the emission keyframes here, so we obviously know where we want our flamethrower to begin emitting. So we could quite simply just select all these keyframes and just drag them across in the timeline. And then we'll check to see how that's looking if we enable our simulation. Check the motion blur samples here. And for the preview, we'll just disable those. And now we'll do a quick preview render. And we just want to understand what the fluid sim is going to do here. So it is shooting towards the camera, but it feels like it loses a bit of its momentum. So we've got a setting in the particle controls called fire momentum, which is essentially a wind force that carries the flames and is separate from the initial velocity. So we'll increase that to 100, which is its maximum value, and we'll also try increasing the fire velocity as well. Sometimes you have to make pretty big changes to get the fluid simulation to change, so it's increased a little bit, but it's still nowhere near what we want. So we're actually going to go into the fluid physics settings, and we have this force region size, which is essentially the scale of the entire simulation. And we're going to increase that to 2500. So while technically we have the same detail in a larger space, it's going to give us that extra kind of power that we need. So after making a few more tweaks and experimenting with a few different variations, eventually I got to something that was working fairly well. Had to go a lot higher with the velocity than was previously done. So we'll just look at some of these keyframes, and with the fire lifetime I decided to have a lower value at the beginning and then have the lifetime actually be longer. That's because the particles were getting in the way and the fire has to push through them, so if they disappear earlier on, the fluids built up behind can come forward. And then at the end I increased the particle velocity all the way up to a much higher value there. But since the fluid sim will be different every time you experiment, it's really just a case of experimenting till you get the values you want. Now when the fire goes into the camera like this, the shading actually needs to be adjusted, so I'm increasing the adjust distance and also decreasing the opacity as well. So as the fire goes into the camera, we'll get these larger shapes. So we have our normal shading in the beginning, and then as the fire pushes forward, we'll get a nicer effect by doing that. Now to get both flamethrowers working in the same 3D space, I'm going to take an additional step and actually duplicate the simulation within the same layer, rather than rendering both of them separately. The first thing I'll do is copy and paste the keyframes from our emitter into our second emitter. This might not be a step that you need to do, but in this specific shot I want two dual flamethrowers that are going to interact with each other, so they need to be in the same layer. So it'll be quite simple. I'll just go through and make sure that these keyframes are on the other hand. And once this is done, we'll be able to reference the other emission locator. So go back through there, make sure that it looks okay. And so this part will get a little bit tedious and is quite time consuming, but like I said, it isn't necessary. But I'm going to add an additional simulation here. Unfortunately, you can't just copy and paste the simulation, so I'm actually going to have to go through the master system and manually copy and paste all of the values and expressions by going to each section, copying and pasting the expression for the particles there, then going into system 2 emitter and alt left clicking, copying that expression. We know that it was using an OBJ model, so we're going through and just transferring all of the parameters in the master system to system 2. So I've done a lot of that off screen here because it's a bit time consuming and won't be applicable to everyone. So we're going to do that for the emitter, the particles and the auxiliary systems, but both systems will share the fluid settings, so we won't have to change those. So I'll keep some of this in. I'm just pasting the same expressions there. So you can get an idea of what this process would be like if you needed to have two fluid simulations interacting with each other. And then once we've gone through all of those settings, we'll want to just double check the position itself, because there is a checkbox with the position, whether you want it to inherit the whether you want the position to be relative to the master simulation, which we don't, because we created a separate emission locator. So we're going to copy the position expression here, paste that into the position of the other system, and just name that to 02. So now we have two fluid simulations in the same space that can interact with each other. And it only works in this example because both flamethrowers are heading in the same direction, but we wouldn't be able to have two separate fluid forces pushing them together, as they both have to be traveling in the same direction for this to work. But as they move towards the camera, they will swirl around each other and interact with each other, and it will definitely pay off in the end result. Be the difference between them looking like two separate smoky simulations, or fire that actually interacts. And as we can see, the shading there adjusts, becomes larger as the fire moves closer to the camera, and that definitely a great tip there for having fire going into the camera. So now I think we'll turn on all of the expensive settings like the motion blur here, put it to full res, and we'll want to render this out as quickly as possible so that we can use this as an asset. Got quite lucky with the fluid sim on this first go here, so I want to render this out so that it's permanently saved as a pre-render. So we'll render this. Two flamethrowers interacting with each other with motion blur will take quite a long time, especially because the fire is so close to the camera. But now we can have a look at this. So there's also this refine soft matte edges, which I decided to copy from the fire blast from the particles comp and just add that effect to the flamethrowers, and it adds some extra motion blur around the edges as well. So that added to the render time. But if you are looking to get some extra motion blur specifically around the edges of the fire, you can add that soft matte edges effect onto the flamethrowers. And then import that pre-render, and we'll just make sure we have our actual simulations turned off, so we're only looking at the render. And then we can give this a preview and see what this looked like. So I think we'll want to add some more motion blur on there as well, but it's got a pretty good feeling of power to it, so it's not a bad result. The other thing we want to adjust is the fire sparks. Now the reason I did them separately is because I find embers can be very tricky to get right, and since they can render so quickly, we can go through so many different iterations very quickly. So by having them as a separate simulation, we can get the fire the way we want, and then we can run as many versions of the embers as we want until we get a simulation that works well. So I've increased the force region size there, like I did with the fire, to get it to reach the camera. Now sometimes when you make changes like this, you can actually break the simulation here. I guess too many particles tried to interpolate within a certain number of frames and it failed to make a smooth emission there. So that's why we have the recache embers and fire option here, so we can adjust the random seed and simply run the simulation again. Always a good idea to save these projects as they can crash. Now I'm going to repeat the same process of having two simulations in the same layer. It's going to use exactly the same method that we used with the fire. And it's only really in this unique scenario that I'm taking the time to copy and paste the whole particle setup, simply because in this shot it definitely is worth the extra time. But like I said, you could probably just render one version and render another version. But in this case, I really want everything to be able to interact with each other and get as much realism as possible. So we've got a version here that we can look at. So it's unlikely you'll get the perfect version of the embers that you're looking for on the first try. So I'm going to try changing the force region size here again, and as you can see we ran into the same issue. So this time I'll actually adjust the random seed of the fluid simulation and then run this again. And rather than increasing the field size, I'm actually going to turn down the simulation fidelity, and that should allow the particles to travel further. And I think we'll go for both. We'll increase the force region size to get the larger area and also decrease the simulation fidelity as well. So this issue popped up again, but this time it's an issue with leftover cached memory. And if we just clear that cached image memory there without making any changes, we'll render this again and now the issue is resolved. So sometimes there can be issues that aren't actually to do with the simulation but just leftover memory that's kind of messing with things a bit. So it's a bit of a bug, but that's how you resolve that issue. It can be frustrating if you don't know about it though. So with these embers, I'm going to pre-render that as another layer. As you can see, these simulations can be a bit temperamental. That's why I like to pre-render all of them. And then we'll import the embers, and we're not going to bring it into the particles comp B. We're going to bring all of our assets into the particles comp, where we created our first simulation, as all of the fire projects have the same export comp anyway, the same glows and everything. So it's like a universal export comp that works with all of the fire. So you can bring different simulations from different projects together and then bring them into the same comp here, and then they'll work when we go to the export comp. So let's do that. Let's take our footage and bring that into the export comp so that we can finally see our simulation coming together. And if we start going through these compositing options here, we can start adjusting some of these values. Increasing the glow threshold will give you more of a reddish look. Decreasing the fire contrast, that will give us a bit of a hotter look with the flames. The smoke contrast will determine how kind of black the smoke is. So we can keyframe that at different points. Usually I just go through each of these values, try 0, try 100, see if it's something that adds to the end result that we're trying to get. I'll increase the fire sharpness here a little bit as well. Maybe increase the distortion strength and also the distortion haze as well, because those effects do look quite nice. And if we snapshot the before and after there, we're just adding a bit of extra haze. Be more noticeable that way. Also have this ground lighting, which is a copy of the simulation with a power pin on there, and that will just give us a bit of lighting straight off the bat, although we are going to look at more advanced lighting techniques in a moment. But that'll work okay for our purposes. So I'm just making a note of the frame rate of our plate. By default, the export comp is 25 frames per second, but we want our custom frame rate here, otherwise we will have a few missing frames when we render things. Now the fire is going to increase in size, so I'm going to put a few keyframes here, specifically the large glow radius, normally going from 500 to, well, 1000 if the fire goes into the camera here. Now the fire isn't getting too overexposed, but if it did look too overexposed, increasing the glow radius would solve that. I'm also going to decrease the heat distortion complexity, as the fire is right in the camera here. We'll lower those distortions. Now we are getting some banding in the fire. That might be because of the soft matte edges effect I added. So I'm actually going to resolve that with a effect here called Pixel Motion Blur. I'll set that to 990 for the shutter angle. And that is just going to add some extra motion blur that will help smooth out those banding issues, which is really only obvious because the fire is going into the camera like this. So that's a great powerful technique that we can use to smooth things out there. I'm also going to turn down the sharpness as well when the fire goes into the camera. And I'll set a few keyframes here for the sharpness as well. So what I did is just change a bit of the contrast when the fire goes into the camera, just to give it a boost to the brightness. In fact, the reason we were increasing the brightness there is something I realized afterwards, is that we still have the project set to 16 bits. If we change it to 32 bits, I think the glow on the fire would be a little bit more overexposed, and then we'd probably be changing some of those settings to kind of spread out the glow. But it's still working and looks decent enough. But if we really wanted to get a much hotter glow on the fire, we could go to 32 bits, be a bit slower, but give us those values. So the next stage we're going to do is create a roto for our character. It's simply just a case of selecting the roto tool, double clicking on the footage. That'll open it up in a separate window here. Make sure it's at full res when you're doing that. And I'm actually going to roto the entire character for the whole shot. It was a little bit of work, but it's going to be really useful to have a matte for our character so we can add lighting effects and stuff happening behind him. So with this roto brush and refine edge here, we can also add some additional motion blur to the edges of our character. We go through here and see we now have our character isolated. And to keep things running smoothly, I'm going to pre-render this as well. Make sure I include the alpha channel in the render. And I'm going to render that as our actor matte. So I'm just building up all these different layers that are going to give me more options when it comes to compositing. So now I'm going to bring the actor matte into our tracking comp. I'm using the tracking comp as a separate place where I can do different tasks away from the simulation. So we're going to start creating some lighting on our actor here. We obviously want the lighting to be isolated on the character, so I'm creating an extract effect here. We're going to try and isolate some of those highlights. This layer is going to be kind of like an overall tone for the lighting, so I'm going to keep quite a bit of the actor and just try and get some interesting values there. Then I'm going to add a fill layer, and usually giving it a fairly washed out color. will work here. And it's looking a little bit grainy, so I'll just add a compound blur. It's already using our layer. Give that a value as 1 and invert the blur to soften it. And now if we change it to a soft light and toggle that on and off, it's created quite a satisfying lighting on the actor's skin. But I'm going to duplicate that layer again. Go back to the extract matte, and this time I really just want the brightest highlights to be isolated, a much more controlled matte here. I'm just going to get the face and the palms there, the parts of the body that would be affected more by the light. Add a CC cross blur on there as well and give that an additive blending mode, and now we have some kind of bright hot spots on his skin that we can adjust to there. And then finally I'm going to duplicate it one more time, and this one's going to be a little bit different. We're going to get just a small range of pixels from the character. It doesn't really matter which, but we just want quite a lot to be missing there. And if we add a compound blur and increase that to 50 and invert the blur, we're going to get some very strange kind of depth looking results on our character. And we can also use our actor as a alpha matte as well. So in this duplicate, I've just renamed it to alpha matte, and I'm going to have that be referenced by the lighting 03 layer there, referencing the alpha matte here. So now we have this quite interesting lighting pass here, creating the illusion of depth there. So we have these 3 different lighting kind of methods all coming together. Obviously it's a bit over the top right now, so we'll change some of these values and see how far we can go and have it look believable. So depending on the lighting and everything, I think we'll go for some nice easy values to understand there. And we'll just do our basic keyframes here so we know where the fire, when the fire appears, when it's going to be its most brightest. And there's too much light at the bottom of the actor, so we're just going to add a mask here and just have most of that lighting be on the top of the actor there. And now we can just go through and make some very basic keyframes here. And so once we've made those, I think we'll go back into the export comp, refresh our memory of where the fire was, and let's actually use that tracking comp as the plate. Since we are adding the lighting, we can now see what the lighting will look like in combination with the simulation there. I've locked the viewer so that I can edit the tracking comp whilst viewing the export comp, so now I can modify these keyframes here in the tracking comp, but the viewer is locked to the export comp there. That's what that little padlock at the top left of the screen there represents. And so once we've added all those keyframes, we have our lighting. I think now we should be able to start making some other adjustments. I noticed that the fire was getting a bit too transparent at the end there. So to really boost the fire, I've actually gone into the extract effects that are actually within the particles pre-comp there. We have to unhide the layers to see them. So I'm just going one step further and just reducing the key amount there, just so as the fire kind of dims out, it gets an extra boost towards the end, just to really make the fire feel like it's fully transparent and engulfing the camera. And so now we're going to add the lighting for the environment as well, as we would expect to see some lighting on that rock at the background. So I've duplicated the footage. I'll begin by adding a motion tile effect of 105. Then we'll go into the keying, add an extract effect. And we're going to try and isolate ranges of the image that we think the crevices of the rock, for example, the darker areas would be affected less. And then if we add our color fill and also a compound blur as well, as we know that by turning this value up can give us some interesting dispersion of the blur. Maybe bring the curves down, want more of a reddish kind of look hitting that rock. And then of course we can duplicate our alpha matte here and then use that to isolate the background lighting from the foreground. So it's very useful having a decent roto for the character. And then we'll change that blending mode to an additive blending mode, re-enable that motion tile, and we can see there's a weird effect happening here. But if we reduce the output width to just the right amount, we can actually fake some micro shadows on the rock there based on where the lighting is coming from. It's like a really advanced way to add lighting. It's almost like creating a fake bump map. So that has worked quite nicely. We'll still have to tone down the effect a bit. We just adjust the values, see if anything could potentially work better. But I think reducing the opacity to 50%. You almost can't tell whether the lighting has been added, and I think that's the point. It's not too bright. I mean, maybe you could have a flash of bright light happening. But I think because it gradually increases and engulfs the frame with the fire, I think the lighting is quite subtle. We're not overdoing anything. And then of course I'm just putting in the keyframes of the opacity of how bright I think the rock should be at different points. And so once we have all our lighting set up and we have our simulation, there is the part of the fire that should be going behind the actor there. So this is a good example to show how having these rendered separately is going to be useful, because the left fireball goes to behind the actor towards the end. So this is again, we can use the matte that we created here, combine that with some fluffy roto here. And this is where a bit of just old-fashioned compositing, adjusting that roto, fading it in just when it should be going behind the character. And so now we've addressed all of those issues, we can finally do our first pre-render of the whole shot and see what kind of improvements can be made. So we'll render this out. Render this and then we'll take a look and see how it's looking so far. So I'll bring back in the plate, the comp that we just rendered, bring that onto the timeline here. It's never perfect on the first version, but that's okay. So I think the embers are looking a little bit too dull, and also there's still a little bit of banding there, so I'm going to go into the export pre-comp here, and I'm actually going to add a bilateral blur, which is going to basically blur everything. It's quite a slow blur as well. So we don't want to use this over the whole simulation, but there are a few frames there where we've really pushed the fire, and there's some banding there with all the sharpness, and so by just finding the worst frames, the frame at the end there, that's the worst, and we'll just put that bilateral blur on there as well, and now we can just see how that's fixed things as well. So the embers, off screen I tried lowering the opacity and it didn't work. It's better to have the embers really pop. It's better to have the elements be bold. They're either there or they're not there. Trying to kind of blur them or tone them down is why the embers didn't look very good then. So, but that's all part of the process, making these renders, playing it back and deciding how it looks, and then once everything comes together we have an effect that looks like this. And these are the same techniques that we also use to achieve these other shots as well. And if you're interested, these shots are part of an upcoming collaborative fan film called Avatar: The Last of the Airbenders by Live Action Avatar, who are always promoting the exciting progress that they're making over on their Instagram at Live Action Avatar. So thanks for watching this tutorial. We'll wrap things up there. Be sure to let us know if you have any questions. Good luck with your projects, and thanks for watching.